In a world that constantly shakes with the tremors of political turmoil, one move has sent shockwaves across the globe. The United States, in a dramatic and unprecedented military action, has seized the Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. This isn't just a headline, this is the kind of moment that defines history. While many of us were still grappling with the chaos of global instability, this single act of force has thrust us into a new era of uncertainty. With this move, the US has boldly taken a stand against what it calls an illegitimate and oppressive regime. But the question that lingers in the air is, what does this mean for the future of international relations? But here's where the story gets even more complicated. The reaction is as divided as the world itself. On one hand, the US faces accusations of overreach, breaching international law, and violating the sovereignty of a nation. On the other, voices are rising in support, calling this a necessary action to rid the world of a dictator. The lines between right and wrong are blurred, and what's at stake is far more than just the fate of one leader, it's the future of the global order. Before we dive deeper, let's take a moment to understand the core of this crisis. Nicolas Maduro has been Venezuela's leader for years, but his regime has been anything but stable. Accusations of corruption, human rights abuses, and an increasingly authoritarian grip on power have painted his leadership in a negative light, both domestically and internationally. But despite the mounting pressure from the international community, Maduro has clung to power with an iron fist, unwilling to step down. The US government has long condemned his rule, labeling it illegitimate, and has even placed sanctions on Venezuela to cripple its economy. But the seizure of Maduro is a dramatic escalation. It isn't just a matter of opposing a leader, it's a bold intervention that fundamentally challenges the sovereignty of a nation. The response has been swift and varied, and it underscores the global divisions that have only grown in recent years. Some nations have rallied behind the US, applauding its stance against a repressive leader. But many others, especially in Europe, have strongly condemned the action, warning that it sets a dangerous precedent for international relations. This is not just a clash of political ideologies. It's a confrontation over what the world stands for. Is the international community willing to tolerate such blatant breaches of sovereignty for the sake of removing tyrants? Or does the principle of respecting a nation's independence outweigh the desire to correct perceived injustices? To fully understand the gravity of the situation, we need to rewind and look at the broader picture. Venezuela's history is marked by decades of political instability, economic struggles, and social unrest. From the rise of Hugo Chavez to Maduro's takeover, Venezuela has struggled to find a stable leadership that serves its people's needs. Under Chavez, Venezuela's oil wealth was used to fuel social programs and solidify his influence, both at home and abroad. But his socialist policies also sowed seeds of division, economic mismanagement, and corruption. When Maduro ascended to power in 2013, the country was already on a precarious path. Despite the promise of reform, Maduro's presidency has been marked by skyrocketing inflation, widespread poverty, and shortages of basic goods. The economy has crumbled under his watch, and the people of Venezuela have borne the brunt of the crisis. But what makes this moment different is not just the political failures, it's the international ramifications. Venezuela's economic collapse and political turmoil have reverberated throughout Latin America, and Maduro's defiant stance has provoked sharp reactions from the US and its allies. And now, with the US, military intervention, the historical dynamics of the region are shifting once again. This is where the clash between sovereignty and interventionism comes to the forefront. The US sees Venezuela's descent as a threat to regional stability, and more specifically, to its own national interests. The question now is whether this intervention will solve anything or if it will deepen the crisis even further. As the dust settles from the initial shock, we enter a pivotal moment in this crisis, the moment when the world realizes the full implications of the US action. The military intervention, the seizing of Maduro, is not just an isolated incident. It is a moment that speaks to deeper tensions between superpowers, the shifting alliances, and the fragile state of international law. In the hours following the US move, the reactions came fast and furious. Within the UN, the condemnation was swift. Russia, China, and many Latin American nations slammed the USS for what they called an illegal act of aggression. For them, it was a breach of international norms that could set a dangerous precedent for global governance. But while the US had expected condemnation from its adversaries, the response from its allies was more complicated. France, Denmark, and several EU members raised strong objections, arguing that the seizure violated the principles of sovereignty and non-aggression enshrined in the UN Charter. Even nations that had long criticized Maduro, like Colombia and Panama, called for restraint and warned against the dangerous implications of US actions. In the midst of these escalating tensions, the US is standing firm. According to Ambassador Mike Waltz, the operation was an essential step to prevent Venezuela from becoming a hub for terrorism, drug trafficking, and foreign adversaries, particularly Iran, Hezbollah, and Cuban intelligence. For many, this intervention is the clearest indication yet that the global order is fracturing, and the rules that have governed international relations for decades are no longer being respected. This crisis is now more than just about Venezuela. It's a direct challenge to the post-World War II world order and its institutions. As we dissect the situation, it becomes clear that this intervention is not just about the seizure of a leader, it's a direct confrontation with the global system itself. What we are witnessing is a breakdown of the very mechanisms that were designed to prevent such unilateral actions. The United Nations was founded on principles that promote peace, respect for sovereignty, and collective action. Yet here we are, in the Security Council, watching as these principles are being tested in real time. The US, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has just taken an action that could be interpreted as a violation of everything the UN stands for. Why? Because this is not just about Venezuela. It's about power, control, and the US asserting its dominance on the global stage. The intervention sends a clear message. If the US perceives a threat, it will act unilaterally, regardless of international opinion. The world has entered an era where the balance of power is increasingly shifting away from multilateralism and toward individual national interests. This is a dangerous game, where the rules are being rewritten in real time and the consequences are far-reaching. What's at stake here is not only Venezuela's future, but the future of the international order. If the US can take such a bold step without facing serious repercussions, what happens next? Will other nations follow suit, using force to achieve their own political objectives? Or will this intervention be a wake-up call for the global community to reassert the values of diplomacy and cooperation? As the world grapples with the implications of the US action, another crisis unfolds. This is the moment when the situation spirals into an even more volatile phase. The seizure of Maduro has already strained international relations, but now the real pressure begins both for the US and for the global community. In Venezuela, the situation is becoming increasingly chaotic. Maduro's supporters, backed by the military and key figures within the regime, rally against the US intervention, framing it as an imperialist attack on the sovereignty of Venezuela. Meanwhile, the opposition, despite being sidelined by the US intervention, finds itself caught in a moral dilemma. Should they align themselves with the US for the promise of a regime change? Or should they distance themselves, knowing that this military action has torn apart the very fabric of international law? For the US, the operation is far from over. The task of stabilizing Venezuela, removing Maduro's influence, and establishing a new government looms large. But the question remains, will this intervention truly bring stability, or will it create a power vacuum that could lead to even greater violence and unrest? The US has presented itself as the defender of democracy, but as the military operation deepens, it faces growing international resistance. Even its closest allies are starting to question the wisdom of such drastic action. On the global stage, the pressure is mounting. Countries like Russia and China are now rallying against the US, calling for a return to diplomacy, for respect for the UN Charter, and for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. These countries see the US action as a direct challenge to their influence in the region, and they will stop at nothing to push back. As the stakes continue to rise, one thing is clear. The situation is quickly spiraling beyond what anyone anticipated, and the path forward is becoming murkier by the day. While the political and diplomatic fallout continues to unfold at the international level, let's turn our attention to the true cost of this conflict: the people of Venezuela. They are the ones who have lived under the oppressive rule of Maduro for years, suffering from a collapsed economy, a humanitarian crisis, and the daily fear of repression. But now, with the US intervention, the stakes have risen for them as well. The situation is no longer just about political change, it's about survival with the US. Taking a direct hand in the leadership transition, many Venezuelans are now faced with the uncertainty of what comes next. The military, the political elite, and even ordinary citizens are caught in the crossfire, uncertain of their futures in a country on the brink of collapse. The fear of further violence is palpable. Many in Venezuela wonder whether this intervention will bring peace or if it will simply create more chaos, with factions fighting for control, both within the country and in the streets. The once hopeful dream of democracy now seems more distant than ever. But amid this uncertainty, there is also a glimmer of hope. The removal of Maduro could be the first step toward a new beginning, one where Venezuela can rebuild itself and chart a course toward a brighter future. For some, this moment represents an opportunity to break free from the chains of dictatorship and reclaim their country's destiny. For others, however, this is just another chapter in a history of foreign intervention and broken promises. The emotional toll on the people of Venezuela cannot be overstated, and whatever happens next will leave a lasting impact on their hearts, minds, and the very soul of their nation. The impact of the U.S. intervention in Venezuela extends far beyond the borders of the South American nation. The shockwaves have already started to reverberate across the globe, affecting geopolitics, international relations, and the very concept of sovereignty itself. In Europe, the U.S. action has sparked heated debates, forcing leaders to confront the uncomfortable reality that the global order is fracturing. Some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, are cautiously supportive of the U.S., aligning themselves with the notion that Maduro's regime was a threat to regional stability. But others, especially in Western Europe, are voicing strong opposition, warning that this kind of unilateral action undermines the principles of international law. China and Russia, two of the U.S. most powerful geopolitical rivals, have condemned the intervention, labeling it an imperialist move that threatens global peace. Their responses underscore the growing divide between the West and the East, a divide that could have far-reaching consequences for global stability. In Latin America, the situation is equally complex. Many countries, especially those with left-wing governments, see the U.S. intervention as an affront to the region's sovereignty. They view this as yet another example of U.S. imperialism harkening back to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, but other countries such as Colombia and Brazil have expressed support for the USS move, viewing it as a necessary step to rid the region of a dangerous and repressive leader. The real question now is, how will this intervention reshape the future of international relations? Will it lead to a new era of power struggles, where the strongest nations act unilaterally to impose their will on weaker states? Or will it inspire a new wave of diplomatic efforts, as nations come together to reaffirm the importance of multilateralism and international cooperation? As the dust begins to settle from this seismic event, it's time to look ahead. What does the future hold for Venezuela, the US, and the world at large? There are three potential scenarios that could unfold, each with its own set of consequences. Scenario 1. A successful transition to democracy. In this scenario, the US intervention leads to the downfall of Maduro, and Venezuela begins a genuine transition to democracy. A new government is established, one that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people, and international pressure leads to free and fair elections. The country starts to rebuild, with foreign aid flowing in and international support for the recovery. The US is seen as a liberator, and this intervention is viewed as a success for democracy. However, even in this ideal scenario, challenges remain. The power vacuum left by Maduro's regime could lead to instability, with various factions vying for control. The international community must remain engaged to ensure that Venezuela's new government is truly democratic and that the country does not fall back into authoritarianism. Scenario 2, a prolonged civil conflict. In this darker scenario, the intervention leads to chaos. With Maduro's removal, the country descends into civil conflict as rival factions struggle for control. The US becomes embroiled in an ongoing conflict, unable to stabilize the country despite its military presence. Venezuela becomes a failed state, with widespread violence and economic collapse. The international community is left to pick up the pieces, but the damage is done both to Venezuela and to the credibility of international interventions. The consequences of this scenario are far-reaching. It would further erode trust in the ability of foreign interventions to bring stability and would embolden other autocratic regimes around the world. The US would likely find itself isolated, facing criticism from allies and adversaries alike. Scenario 3, a global stalemate. In this scenario, the US intervention fails to achieve its goals, and Venezuela remains a divided country. The international community remains at an impasse, with the US and its allies unable to impose their will on the situation, while Russia, China, and other powers continue to support the Maduro regime. The US pulls back, unable to justify its actions, and Venezuela continues to languish under Maduro's rule, a symbol of failed foreign policy. This stalemate would further fuel global distrust in the US and its leadership, causing many nations to question the role of the US in international conflicts. It would also strengthen the resolve of autocratic regimes, who would see the failure of US intervention as proof that the West cannot impose its values on sovereign nations. As the dust settles and we reflect on the magnitude of what's transpired, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The world is changing, and so are the rules that govern it. The US. Intervention in Venezuela is not just an isolated event. It's a stark reminder that global power dynamics are in flux. The decisions made now will shape the future not just for Venezuela, but for the entire international system. The question remains, what kind of world do we want to live in? Is it one where the powerful nations dictate the terms, using military force to impose their will? Or will we strive for a world where diplomacy, respect for sovereignty, and international law guide our actions? For Venezuela, the future is uncertain. Will the country emerge from this crisis stronger and more democratic? Or will it descend further into chaos? Only time will tell. But for the rest of the world, the implications of this intervention are far-reaching. The US may have acted with a sense of moral clarity, but the global consequences are not so clear-cut. Countries are watching closely, and the lessons learned from this crisis will undoubtedly influence future foreign policies. As we look ahead, one thing is certain: the global order is at a crossroads. The question is whether the world will move toward a new era of cooperation and diplomacy, or if it will fall further into the realm of unilateral actions and unchecked power. The world is watching, and we must all ask ourselves, what role will we play in shaping the future?